Hi, welcome to the 10-minute wrap-up of Chapter 24, looking at the origin of species. Now, looking at Chapter 23, now that we know how this change occurs, let's talk about species, and then let's talk a little bit about change of species. And so basically what we're talking about is the biological concept of species, which is basically looking at reproductive isolation. That is, two populations that don't mate with one another tend to be different species or can become different species. And this is what Darwin called the mystery of mysteries, of how do we get different species. And so again, what is a species? And we are looking at the biological concept. This is two organisms that populations that tend to not mate with one another. And again, we look at these individuals here are all very different, but again, they can and do often mate with one another. Whereas these two individuals here we look at are as different as these individuals, yet they don't mate with one another. Why is that? Well, again, we need to look at what a species is. And what I said before, a species is a group of organisms that mate and produce offspring together. That typically mate and produce offspring together. That want to produce offspring together. Different species rarely, if ever, create healthy, fertile offspring together. They just don't want to be together, or mechanically they can't come together. Okay? How do we get a new species? Is typically we look at groups that stop mating together. Once they stop mate together, then again, if they're separated by long enough, these random mutations will come up where they don't. And we're going to be looking at reproductive isolation, which is the existence of barriers that impede two species from producing viable and fertile offsprings. And then we also kind of look at hybrids, which is our crosses between different species, which actually can happen. Now, when we look at this, we got to look at barriers. There's a number of different barriers that we can have. And basically what we're doing is, can you mate? And then can the zygotes come together? And so pre-zygotic barriers, these are the barriers that occur before the union of two matings. And so in habitat isolation, basically we have organisms that inhabit different habitats. If one is always in the water or one is always on the land, then they will not meet. In temporal isolation, we tend to see that one is active during the day and one is active during the night, and they just may never come together. Behavioral isolation, again here in the blue-footed booby, is that where we have a mating ritual or mating dance that has to occur in order for them to mate. And if you don't have the right mating ritual, you will not mate. Again, looking at mating attempts, we have mechanical isolation. Again, if the male unit doesn't fit into the female unit, or if it's on the wrong side, then it's not going to happen. In post-reproductive barriers, we tend to see things like in sea urchins that produce their gametes, spread their gametes, is that these gametes have a docking station for one another. And so if the male gamete doesn't have the proper docking station for the female gamete, then they won't come together. And so this is a reason why we may have two different species of sea urchins spawn and release their gametes into the water right next to one another, but they don't produce offspring. Again, once a mating does occur, a fertilization event does occur, sometimes we see reduced hybrid fertility, we see hybrid breakdown, which is eventually over time that the hybrids break down. Again, here we see the combination of a horse and a jackass produces a mule, which again is infertile, cannot produce offspring, although it's a very, very robust organism. Is this mating concept of species the only way to look at species? No. Again, we have morphological species concept, which is typically the one that we tend to have, where people become experts at looking at different organisms. You can tell a different species by looking at them. We have the ecological species concept of where what organisms do where, and then the phylogenetic species concept of who has a common ancestor. Again, this is also looking at mating. There are over 20 different kind of species concepts that are out there, and kind of which one is right, we're still in the process of kind of working that out. So, what we're going to do today and what we're going to do in this class is basically look at this reproductive species idea. Again, but then how can this happen? How can we have two species mate? Let's say we have a pool of fish here. If we have a separation of that pool, and those fish are not able to climb from one pool to another, we have what's called allopatric speciation, where there's separation between physical separation. And sympatric speciation is where we have speciation occurring right in the same area. Is this possible? Again, conceptually, you can really look at it, and again, this is an example of the Grand Canyon, where these two areas here are probably only a mile or two apart, and we have two different species of ground squirrels in here. Again, those ground squirrels are not able to mate with one another because, again, they can't fly over, they can't walk underneath, and there's no possible way, and we see that happen a number of times. They can't do it, they will never mate, and they are basically two different species. Can we do this in the laboratory? Again, we've taken some flies, we've raised them on starch media and on maltose media, and we've done this for 40 generations, and we see that the flies have a difficulty mating with one another after this time. But is it impossible for them to mate? No, they do sometimes mate inside of there, and they will kind of come back, hybridize together and come back. Now, why didn't they do this for 80 generations? Why didn't they do it for 1,000 generations to see if they can get different species? I don't know why. Again, so what we tend to see is habitat differentiation. We see the appearance of new ecological niches. We tend to see that favor sympatric speciation, where one species may go on and exploit new areas. Sexual selection, also we tend to see sympatric speciation occur because, again, you have preferences between individuals. And so what we're going to say is there's possible outcomes to a hybridization code. So once we have this barrier to gene flow, in areas where we have gene flow occurring, that hybridization, there can be a number of different things. As number one, these hybrids can die out, and therefore you would reinforce the speciation event. The hybridizations can bring this together, or again, the hybrids can be stable. All of those things happen. Again, there are a number of different instances where we've seen this occur in nature, and I'm not going to go into that. But one of the things we really want to do, and what Darwin looked at, is basically how fast does this happen? And again, when Darwin was looking at it, they were looking at fossils, they were seeing this kind of slow, graduated pattern. But in reality, sometimes speciation can happen very fast. Sometimes it will take really slow. And so, again, when we look at the fossil record, we see kind of both cases where speciation occurs very fast, and we can see where speciation happen relatively slow. Again, we can see speciation as little 4,000 years for certain fish. We can see it in 40 million years for certain beetles. On average, we see speciation events occur roughly about every 6.5 million years. We human beings are roughly a little bit less than that. Does it take a lot of genetic change in order to make a new species? No. There's only one allele, a single gene for speciation in Japanese land snail basically determines whether you are right or left-handed for the snail. Only the right-handed snail can only mate with another right-handed snail, and the left-handed snail can only mate with another left-handed snail. It's only one gene that's required to do that. Again, what can cause this? There are certain errors in cell division. For the most part, we think mammals are very resistant to errors in cell division. That means that we die if we have these errors, but there are some that we see. There's a tetraploid mammal, the red viscera rat is kind of a unique genetic species. Being a different species is very complicated, and we talked about this in class of things like Great Danes and Chihuahuas not being able to mate with one another. And so in a case like that, we may have something that we call a ring species, where two individual species cannot breed, but again, through a succession of intermediary species, that those individuals may be able to breed, may be able to hybridize. And again, we see that example of that in certain salamander species that we see here in California, in the Bay regions. So chimps and bonobos, are they the same species, or are they different? Human beings, are we the same species, or are we different? Can we mate and produce viable offspring? No one knows. So